The girl didn't flinch when the red laser settled over her heart, and the enemy Mafia boss standing 10 feet away felt the world tilt as he recognized the locket around her neck. Fog rolled off the Han River like the city was trying to hide its sins. The bridge was desolate, a stray cat darting between rusted girders, the distant hum of a midnight train, the cold metal of the railing biting into Amaris Vale's palms. She was waiting for a contact that would never come when the headlights cut through the mist, and 6 black SUVs sealed both ends of the passage. Everyone moved with practiced violence. The shadowed figures in tactical gear spilled out, weapons raised. The air hissed with the sound of a dozen safeties clicking off at once. Amaris didn't run. She stood by the railing with her chin slightly lifted, looking at the circle of gunmen the way you look at a sunset when you know it's your last. No trembling, no pleading, no frantic search for an exit. Just a slow, steady breath, and a gaze so hauntingly peaceful it made the lead hunter, Park Yi-hyun, pause his finger on the trigger. "You're late," she whispered, her voice carrying through the damp air like a ghost. "I've been expecting a ghost, but all I got was you." In the center of the blockade, a man in a tailored dark suit stepped out of the lead vehicle. Han Junseok didn't draw a weapon. His expression remained a mask of obsidian, but something in his deep-set eyes shattered, like a glass tower falling in slow motion. He hadn't moved because of the tactical advantage. He moved because he knew that face. He knew the way she stood when she was ready to break. The hunter's aim was wavering. Amaris noticed that first. Not the scope, but the microscopic tremor in the man's wrist. The way the red dot danced from her throat to her chest and back again, like the gun itself was terrified of what it was about to do. He was elite, but he was hesitant. She could see it in the tension of his boots. He wasn't a man who wanted to kill a princess. He was a man following an order he didn't believe in. He had probably been tracking her for weeks, only to find that the monster he was hunting was just a girl with eyes full of starlight and sorrow. The heavy iron gates of the Vale estate didn't just keep the world out, they kept the silence in. Inside the manor, the air always smelled of expensive sandalwood and old secrets, a combination that often made Amaris feel like she was breathing through a veil. Her room was a masterpiece of ivory and silk, a gilded cage where every porcelain vase cost more than a common person's life, and every window was reinforced with glass thick enough to stop a bullet. She stood before the full-length mirror, her dark hair pulled back into that familiar practical bun. She traced the line of her jaw, noting the slight gloss of unshed tears that seemed to be a permanent part of her reflection these days. To the world, she was the crown jewel of the Southern Syndicate, a delicate, striking presence intended to be seen and never heard. But to her father, she was a strategic asset, a bridge to be traded when the bloodline required it. The heavy oak door groaned open, and the rhythmic tap of polished shoes echoed against the marble. It was her father's shadow, the men who moved like ghosts through the hallways, ensuring she never walked more than 10 feet without a silent witness. The expectations were a physical weight. She was expected to be graceful, to be silent, and above all, to be loyal to a legacy built on the bodies of those who dared to cross them. "Your father is waiting in the study, Miss Vale." The voice was cold, professional. "The Northern Empire has made a move. He expects your presence at the briefing." Amaris felt a flicker of that familiar, dangerous gravity in her chest. Every meeting was a reminder of the war she was born into, a generational feud that demanded she view the world in shades of red and blue, us and them. She thought of the Han River, the fog, and the intense, focused gaze of Han Junseok. In that world, he was the enemy, a monster to be feared. But in the quiet of her own mind, she remembered the way his broad shoulders had blocked the wind, the way his presence felt like the only real thing in a life made of expensive illusions. As she walked down the grand staircase, her slim, delicate frame cast a long shadow against the portraits of ancestors who had died for the very empire that now felt like a noose. She moved with a graceful posture that hid the trembling in her heart. She was the heart of the South, meant to beat only for her family's glory. But the heart is a rebellious thing. It doesn't recognize borders, and it certainly doesn't follow the rules of blood. She was walking into a room full of wolves, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the bite. She was only afraid of the silence she would have to keep. The rain in Seoul had a way of blurring the lines between enemies, turning the city into a watercolor of neon lights and gray shadows. 6 months ago, the world hadn't been divided into empires. It had just been a Tuesday night, and the air had been thick with the scent of ozone and asphalt. Amaris had escaped the watchful eyes of her father's security, slipping out of a side service door just to feel the rain on her skin without a witness. She had ended up in a small, nameless 24-hour pharmacy, her hair damp and clinging to her neck, searching for nothing more than a packet of bandages for a blister. He was already there, standing by a shelf of generic medicines. He wasn't the Northern Emperor then. He was just a man in a rain-drenched coat with broad shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of the entire sky. Han Junseok had turned as she approached, his sharp, angular face catching the dim fluorescent light. There was a jagged cut above his eyebrow, the blood blooming like a dark flower against his light olive skin. He didn't look dangerous, he looked exhausted. "You're bleeding," she had whispered, her voice naturally soft, lacking the rehearsed steel she used at home. She didn't ask who he was or why he was hurt in a neighborhood he clearly didn't belong to. In the quiet of the aisle, the rules of bloodlines didn't exist. Junseok had watched her with a focused, intense gaze, his jaw tightening as she reached out. For a second, his hand had twitched toward the inside of his jacket, a reflex born of a life lived in shadows. But then he saw her eyes, large, expressive, and filled with a genuine, guileless concern that made him hesitate. He let her hand settle against his forehead, her touch cool and steady. "It's nothing," he had murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in her chest. "Just a reminder that I should have stayed inside." "The rain is better than the walls," she replied, a small, sad smile touching her lips. She had opened the bandages, her fingers nimble as she cleaned the wound with a stray antiseptic wipe. She didn't notice the way he held his breath, mesmerized by the delicate strength in her frame. To him, she was a ghost of grace in a world of grit. To her, he was a shield that had finally cracked. They stayed there for 20 minutes, talking about the weather and the bitter taste of the pharmacy's coffee, two strangers hiding from the storms that waited for them outside. No last names were exchanged. No territories were claimed. When he finally walked out into the night, he didn't know he had just shared a moment of peace with the Southern Syndicate's crown jewel. And as Amaris watched him disappear into the fog, she didn't know she had just saved the life of the man she was born to destroy. The peace of the pharmacy was a phantom memory now, replaced by the suffocating heat of the Southern Syndicate's war room. Amaris stood at the periphery, her slim frame feeling more delicate than ever against the backdrop of high-definition monitors and tactical maps. At the head of the table sat Kang Min-yi, a man whose ambition was a physical rot you could almost smell. Her father's absence was a deafening roar. He had retreated into the shadows of the estate, leaving the cleaning of the empire to a man who viewed people as obstacles to be ground into dust. Min-yi didn't look at the maps. He looked at the grainy black and white surveillance still frame projected on the wall. It was the bridge. It was the moment Han Junseok had stepped in front of her. The image was blurred by the Han River fog, but the emotional geometry was unmistakable, a shield and a heart, unified against the world. A bloodline is only as strong as its purest link. Min-yi's voice was like a blade being dragged over stone. He didn't raise his voice, yet the air in the room seemed to vanish. He turned his focused, serpent-like gaze toward the generals of both empires, men who had once looked at Amaris with protective respect and at Junseok with fearful awe. But when the princess of the south sleeps with the wolf of the north, the blood is no longer pure. It is a contagion. He slammed a heavy folder onto the mahogany table. Inside were the warrants of execution, stamped with the seals of both syndicates. The unthinkable had happened. The two warring empires had found the one thing they could agree on, the elimination of the traitors who had dared to bridge the gap. "The price," Minyi announced, his eyes gleaming with a sick, predatory light, "is 10 billion won for each of their heads. But to the soldier who brings me their joined hands, I offer a seat at this table." The shift in the room was instantaneous. Amaris watched as the men she had known since childhood, men who had guarded her playrooms and her gardens, slowly lowered their eyes, their expressions hardening into the cold, calculating masks of hunters. The bond of loyalty had been severed by the weight of gold. "They are no longer our own," Minyi declared, his voice rising to fill the vacuum of the room. "They are ghosts walking. Every street in Seoul is now a cage. Every shadow is a barrel. Hunt them down. Burn the bridge they stood on." Amaris felt a cold shiver trace the line of her spine. She wasn't just a daughter anymore. She was a target. And somewhere across the city, in the dark heart of the Northern Empire, Junseok would be hearing the same verdict. The world had just become a very small, very dangerous place. As she slipped out of the room before the guards could realize she was no longer a guest but a prisoner, she knew the gilded cage had finally shattered. The hunt had begun. The cabin was buried in the jagged folds of the Buckhanson Mountains, a skeletal structure of timber and stone that smelled of damp pine and wood smoke. Outside, the wind howled through the cedars, sounding like the distant cries of the empires they had left behind. Inside, the only light came from the dying embers in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. The silence here was heavy, a suffocating weight that forced every unspoken word to the surface. Amaris knelt on the floor, her delicate frame silhouetted by the orange glow. Her hands, usually so steady, had a slight, rhythmic tremble as she dipped a cloth into a basin of warm water. Beside her, Han Junseok sat on a low wooden bench, his broad shoulders hunched, his immaculate suit jacket discarded on the floor like a piece of useless armor. A jagged graze from a high-velocity round tracked across his ribs, the blood dark and sluggish against his olive skin. As she pressed the damp cloth to the wound, he let out a sharp, hissed breath, his jaw tightening until the bone seemed ready to snap. For a moment his hand flew out, his fingers locking around her wrist with the crushing force of a man who lived by the sword. Amaris didn't pull away. She met his intense, dark gaze with a gloss of tears in her eyes, not from pain, but from the sheer, agonizing impossibility of their proximity. "You're hurting," she whispered, her voice a soft fracture in the silence. "The wound is nothing," Junseok rasped, his grip on her wrist softening, his thumb tracing the pulse point where her heart hammered against her skin. "The price on your head, that is the pain I can't breathe through." She looked down, her lips slightly parted as she worked to stitch the edges of his broken skin. The intimacy was a dangerous gravity, pulling them toward a center that didn't exist in the world of syndicates and bloodlines. In this room, he wasn't the shield of the North, and she wasn't the heart of the South. They were just two people bleeding in the dark. "They won't stop until we're ghosts," she said, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Junseok reached up, his fingers catching a stray tear that had finally escaped her arched eyebrows. His touch was protective, emotionally restrained, yet filled with a longing that bordered on grief. He knew that by saving her, he had condemned her to a life on the run. He knew that their love was a declaration of war against the only world they had ever known. "Then let us be ghosts," he murmured, leaning his forehead against hers. For a heartbeat, the war outside vanished. There were no empires, no hunters, and no death warrants. There was only the heat of his skin, the scent of the mountains, and the terrifying realization that they had already fallen too far to ever climb back out. The snap of a dry branch outside was the only warning they received. It wasn't the clumsy stumble of a forest animal. It was a rhythmic, intentional wait, the sound of a predator closing the distance. Junseok's head snapped up, his deep-set eyes instantly losing their warmth, replaced by the calculating coldness of a man back in the war. Before Amaris could ask, his hand was over her mouth, his palm warm and smelling of the antiseptic she had just applied to his skin. Yi Hyun, he breathed against her ear. The name sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Park Yi Hyun didn't use armies. He was the ghost who walked through walls, the hunter whose contract was never cancelled. A sudden, sharp metallic thwip shattered the silence. A high-tension cable smashed through the cabin's singular window, followed by the hiss of a smoke canister. "Go!" Junseok roared, grabbing his discarded jacket and shoving Amaris toward the back crawlspace. They burst through the rear door just as the first tactical light cut through the gray smoke behind them. The forest was a vertical maze of jagged rock and ancient pine. Amaris stumbled, her slim frame jarring against the uneven earth, but Junseok was there, a broad-shouldered shield moving with terrifying speed despite his wound. Behind them, the low hum of an engine began to roar, a blacked-out pursuit vehicle tearing through the underbrush like a nightmare made of steel. They reached the hidden clearing where the sleek, dark sedan was stashed under a tarp. Junseok threw her into the passenger seat, the engine screaming to life with a predatory growl. As they tore onto the narrow, winding mountain road, the headlights of their pursuers flickered in the rearview mirror like the eyes of a wolf. The chase was a blur of G-force and screaming tires. Junseok drove with a controlled fury, the car dancing on the edge of cliffs that dropped into nothingness. Amaris watched his hands, the way his fingers committed to the wheel with the same intensity she had seen in the pharmacy. He wasn't just driving to save his life. He was driving to protect the heart he had just rediscovered. A black SUV lunged from a side trail, ramming their flank with a bone-jarring crunch. Amaris let out a soft cry, her hands flying to the dashboard. Through the tinted glass of the rival vehicle, she caught a glimpse of a man with a clinical, detached expression. Yi Hyun. He didn't look angry, he looked focused. "Hold on," Junseok growled, his jaw set in a hard line. He slammed the brakes, letting the SUV overshot them by a fraction of an inch, then floored it, the car fishtailing as they dove down a steep pedestrian path too narrow for the larger vehicle. Branches whipped against the windshield like lashes. They were no longer royalty, they were prey. But as the lights of the city began to twinkle far below, Amaris realized the hunt hadn't broken them, it had fused them. They were ghosts now, and ghosts are very hard to catch. The neon glow of a subway station at 3:00 a.m. was the only sanctuary left. Amaris sat on a cold plastic bench, her slim frame swallowed by an oversized coat, her heart still racing from the mountain descent. The air down here was stale, smelling of ozone and the heavy dampness of the city's underbelly. A shadow detached itself from the tiled pillars, a man with graying temples and an upright, military bearing that even age couldn't soften. Seo Hyun-woo didn't offer a hug or a smile. He sat beside her, staring at the empty tracks. He had been her father's most trusted advisor, the man who had taught Amaris how to read a room before she could read a book. He was her mentor, the only person left in the Southern Syndicate who still saw her as a human being rather than a traitor. "You look like your mother when she realized the man she loved was a monster," Hyun-woo said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He reached into his pocket and produced a small, silver flash drive, pressing it into her palm. "These are the keys, Amaris. The offshore accounts, the digital signatures for the shipping manifests, the names of the politicians who sleep in your father's pocket." Amaris felt the weight of the drive. It was a concentrated vial of her family's power. "Why are you giving me this?" she whispered, her large eyes reflective in the dim light. "Because Kang Minyi isn't just hunting you. He's liquidating everything your father built. He wants a throne of ash," Hyun-woo replied. Finally turning to look at her, his gaze was paternal but stern. "But understand this. To use these keys, you must do more than just run. You must burn the bridge behind you. You have to betray the blood in your veins to save the soul in your chest. If you dismantle this empire to save Junseok, there is no going back. You will be a woman without a name, without a home, and without a family." Amaris looked at the silver drive, her lips slightly parted. She thought of the gilded cages and the sandalwood-scented halls that had never felt like home. She thought of Junseok's broad shoulders and the way he had stepped in front of a dozen lasers just to give her one more breath. "I've lived in a cage my whole life, Hyun-woo," she said, her voice finding a sudden, crystalline steadiness. "I'd rather be a ghost with him than a princess in a graveyard." Hyun-woo nodded slowly, standing up as the distant hum of a train began to vibrate through the floor. "Then move fast. Yi Hyun is already rerouting. And Amaris, if you're going to kill an empire, don't aim for the heart, aim for the ledger." He vanished into the shadows of the tunnel just as the train screamed into the station, leaving her alone with the tools of her father's destruction and a choice that would change the underworld forever. The scent of expensive jasmine perfume always preceded Yurahan, a fragrance that felt like a floral shroud in the narrow, dim hallways of the safe house network. Yura had been the Northern Empire's favored daughter long before Amaris had appeared like a crack in the foundation. She stood now in the shadows of the basement entryway, her eyes reflecting the cold, clinical light of her phone screen. To Yura, Amaris wasn't a soul to be saved. She was a glitch in the machine of her own ambition. Amaris was preparing to leave for the rendezvous point when Yura stepped into the light. Her expression was one of practiced sympathy, a mask that Amaris, in her desperate hope for an ally, didn't immediately see through. "Junseok is compromised," Yura whispered, her voice a sharp, urgent hiss. "Yi Hyun found the perimeter. He's drawing them away to the east docks, but he told me to take you through the tunnels. If you stay here, you're both dead." Amaris felt a surge of fear, not for herself, but for the man who had become her shield. Her internal compass, usually so attuned to the shifts in a room, was clouded by the dangerous gravity of her love. She followed Yura into the subterranean dampness of the city's old service tunnels, the air thick with the smell of wet concrete and stagnant water. They walked in a silence that grew heavier with every step. Amaris watched the back of Yura's head, noticing the way her posture remained rigid, almost triumphant. The realization hit her too late, the way the shadows didn't move quite right, the way the hum of the city above seemed to vanish into a vacuum. "Where is he, Yura?" Amaris asked, her voice trembling, her slim frame tensing as she stopped. Yura turned and the mask finally shattered. Her eyes were bright with a manic, boiling jealousy, the look of someone who had watched the person they wanted choose an enemy over them. "He's exactly where a traitor belongs," Yura said, her full natural lips curling into a sneer. "And you're the bait that will bring him to his knees." Before Amaris could move, a heavy steel door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the tunnel. From the darkness of the alcoves, 3 figures in tactical gear stepped forward, their faces obscured, the red and blue glow of their sights already dancing across her heart. Yura didn't look back as she ascended the metal stairs, leaving Amaris alone in the cold. Amaris leaned against the damp wall, her hands flat against the surface, trying to find the slow exhale she had used at the bridge. She was separated from her protector, caught in a trap built by the very empire she was trying to love. But as she felt the silver flash drive pressed against her hip, she realized that while they had taken her shield, they had forgotten that she was the one who held the keys to their destruction. The heart was cornered, but it was finally starting to beat with a rhythm of its own. The cold of the tunnel floor seeped through Amaris' clothes, but it was the arrival of Kang Minyi that turned the air to ice. He walked with a predatory grace, his footsteps echoing against the damp concrete like a ticking clock. When he reached the steel cage where she was held, he didn't look at her with anger. Instead, he looked at her with a terrifying, clinical curiosity, as if she were a specimen that had finally been pinned to a board. "The heart of the South," Minyi mused, his voice a low, melodic poison. He leaned against the bars, his expensive suit a sharp contrast to the filth of the subterranean passage. "Do you know what they're calling you in the boardrooms? A tragedy, a cautionary tale about what happens when a princess forgets her place." Amaris stood slowly, her slim frame trembling but her gaze fixed. She looked at him through the gloss of tears she refused to let fall. "I didn't forget my place, Minyi. I found a world where people like you don't exist." Minyi laughed, a short, dry sound that didn't reach his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. Inside lay a single, silver-plated bullet engraved with the Northern Empire's crest. He slid it through the bars, letting it clatter onto the floor at her feet. "I'm a businessman, Amaris, and business dictates that I provide a solution to this complication," he said, his expression hardening into something jagged and sharp. "Junseok is coming for you. He's tearing through the city like a man possessed, burning his own legacy to find a girl who was never his to begin with. He'll be here within the hour." He leaned closer, his scent of mint and tobacco filling the small space. "Here is the deal. When he breaks through that door, you will use the weapon I've left for you. You kill the Northern Emperor. You prove to the world that your loyalty to the South and to me is absolute. Do that and you walk out of here. Your father's sins are forgiven. You return to the palace and we tell the world you were a double agent all along." Amaris looked at the bullet, then back at the man who represented everything she loathed. "And if I refuse?" Minyi's face smoothed into a mask of indifference. "Then you die here, a nameless traitor in a dark hole. No crown, no history, no one to remember you but the rats. You'll be a ghost before you ever get to say goodbye." He turned to leave, the shadows swallowing his form. "Choose wisely, Amaris. Love is a fleeting chemical reaction, but an empire is forever." Left alone in the silence, Amaris picked up the cold silver bullet. Her lips parted as a slow exhale escaped her. Minyi thought he had given her a choice between death and betrayal, but as her fingers brushed the flash drive still hidden in her pocket, she realized he had given her something else. The perfect opportunity to show him exactly what happens when the heart finally stops beating for the Empire and starts beating for itself. The shadows in the tunnel seemed to deepen as the minutes bled into one another, but inside the cage the air had shifted. Amaris no longer looked like the innocent caught in danger. She sat on the cold floor, the silver bullet resting in her open palm, her head bowed just enough to invite the arrogance of anyone watching. When the heavy door at the top of the stairs groaned open again, she didn't look up immediately. She waited for the rhythmic, self-assured click of Minyi's designer shoes. He stepped back into the light of the cage, looking down at her with a smirk that was as sharp as a razor. "The hour is almost up, Amaris. Is your hand ready to pull the trigger, or is your heart still clouded by that dangerous gravity?" Amaris looked up then, her large, dark brown eyes glossy with tears, her lips slightly parted as if she were struggling for air. She let a single tear streak down her cheek, the salt stinging her warm skin. "I'm terrified, Minyi," she whispered, her voice a soft, broken fracture that made her look more vulnerable than she had ever been. "You're right. I was a fool. He's a monster and I'm just a girl who wanted to be more than a bridge." Minyi's ego fed on her submission like a predator on a fresh kill. He leaned closer, his guard dropping as he savored the sight of the southern princess finally breaking. He reached through the bars, his fingers tilting her chin up. "That's my girl. The heart belongs in the palace, not in the dirt." In that moment of total proximity, Amaris moved. It wasn't a movement of violence, but of surgical precision. As she leaned into his touch, appearing to seek comfort, her fingers slipped into the side pocket of his tailored jacket. She didn't go for a weapon. She went for the master keycard, the one that controlled the subterranean network's heavy security locks. She pulled back just as quickly, the card hidden in the folds of her oversized coat. Her expression remained one of trembling defeat. "If I do this," she stammered, "I need to know I won't be a prisoner in the manor again. I need to know you'll let me breathe." Minyi chuckled, his eyes glowing with the triumph of a man who thought he had regained control over a rogue asset. "You'll have all the air you can handle, princess. Now, get ready. He's at the perimeter." As Minyi turned to signal his men, the arrogance in his posture obscuring his view of her hands, Amari's face transformed. The gloss in her eyes remained, but the reflectiveness was now like ice, not water. She wasn't the damsel in distress anymore. She was a woman who had just stolen the keys to the kingdom from the man who thought he owned her soul. With a slow, steady exhale, she felt the weight of the silver flash drive and the keycard together. She had used her vulnerability as a shroud, and now the heart was unbound. She wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was waiting for the door to open so she could finish what the empires had started. The industrial border between the southern and northern territories was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and jagged cranes, illuminated by the harsh, flickering strobes of police sirens and tactical floodlights. On one side, the southern syndicate had lined up in a wall of black steel. On the other, Junseok's northern empire stood like a mountain range of obsidian. The air hummed with the electric tension of 500 fingers resting on 500 triggers. Then, the heavy steel doors of the central warehouse groaned open, and Amaris Vale stepped into the no-man's land. She looked small against the backdrop of the two massive armies, her delicate frame silhouetted by the crossing beams of red and blue lasers. But as she walked toward the center of the bridge, her posture was graceful and her head was held high. In her right hand, she held the master keycard. In her left, the silver flash drive that contained the digital DNA of every crime her family had ever committed. Minyi stepped forward from the southern line, his face contorted in a sneer of triumph. "Kill her," he screamed, his voice cracking against the wind. "Kill the traitor and the wolf." But no one fired. The soldiers on both sides watched as Amaris reached the exact center of the border. Han Junseok broke from his line, his broad shoulders tensed, his deep-set eyes locked on hers with a mix of terror and awe. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply stood beside her, a living shield that was no longer needed. "Lower your weapons," Amaris said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden, vacuum-like silence of the docks, it carried like a bell. "I have the ledgers. I have the accounts. I have the names of every man in this circle who has taken a bribe and every politician who has signed a death warrant." She looked directly at the southern generals, then at the northern lieutenants. "Minyi wants a war because he thrives on the ash, but look at yourselves. You are fighting for ghosts and gold that doesn't belong to you. If a single shot is fired tonight, I press upload. The empires won't just fall. They will be erased from history by the authorities before the sun rises." The silence stretched, agonizingly thin. Minyi lunged forward, reaching for a sidearm, but his own men who had seen Amaris grow up, men who saw the heart finally taking command, stepped in his way. The greed that had fueled the hunt was replaced by a cold, survivalist realization. One by one, the red laser dots vanished from Amaris' chest. The barrels of the rifles dipped toward the concrete. The impossible love had done what a century of violence couldn't. It had created a stalemate so absolute that peace was the only option left. Amaris turned to Junseok. Her eyes were still glossy, but her hand didn't shake as she pressed the drive into his palm. "We aren't their prizes anymore," she whispered. The two empires stood frozen at the border, watching as the princess of the south and the boss of the north turned their backs on the war. They walked away from the lights and the guns, moving into the shadows of the city not as traitors, but as the architects of a new era where bloodlines were no longer destiny. The empires hadn't just fallen, they had been outgrown.